Hello and welcome to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome to today's topic of Realpolitik. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we're starting out with this theme. And the main theme today is nationalism. And the fact is, nationalism becomes the dominant force of unity in Western society after 1850, after all those revolutions of 1848. And so I think it behooves us for a moment at least to take a look at what nationalism is. Now, in most history classes, what you usually define it as is hyper-patriotism. And some might immediately say, oh, well, what's the problem with that? Well, there can be a very big problem, because once you get to the point of hyper-patriotism, you often get to the point where you don't see any of your faults. In fact, you will assert that you have none, that you are perfect, you are the greatest, you are the best. And that can lead to some very devastating consequences. Let me show you a little cartoon to figure it out. So look at the far left. Patriotism. I'm going to work on my house because I believe it's the best house. So again, you're proud of what you have. Nationalism says, my house is the best house because it's my house. Patriotism says, hey neighbor, can I see your house? I'm trying to improve my house. Nationalism says, give me your house so it becomes part of my house because my house is the best house. Patriotism says, hey, come into my house and see all the work that I've done. Nationalism says, stay out of my house because I have the best house that already contains all the best people. Again, nationalism is often anti-immigrant. And finally, patriotism says, well, my house is, oh, hey there, nationalism? What are you doing here? Hey now, I don't like the look in your eyes. Now, I am patriotism. And that becomes the problem, is by definition, this hyper-patriotism of nationalism becomes so nationalistic that not only do you believe that you are the best because, well, it's you, not only do you believe that everyone else needs to get out to create a homogenous, 100% whatever you are, your culture, you begin to kick people out and are willing to kill people, deport them, detain them, disappear them, even kill them in defense of what you believe is your true culturalness, your true national identity. And it can often also lead to expansion, where you believe that because you are so good, then you also need to go conquer your neighbor and show how good you really are because you are inherently superior to them. Well, this is what takes place across Western societies, especially Europe, post-1848. Now remember, all those revolutions failed during this period due to a lack of unity among the rebels in terms of ethnic disunion and class distinctions. Again, think of Germany, Italy, Austrian Empire, France. They all failed due to disunity among the rebels and would see conservatism be reestablished. Well, after 1848, we see the emergence of what's called Realpolitik. The failure of the revolutions of 1848 for liberals and romantics alike demonstrated that strong idealism was not enough to accomplish the revolutionary goals. The Age of Realism replaced Romanticism as the dominant philosophy after 1850. The political outgrowth of realism was this notion of Realpolitik, the accomplishment or the accomplishing of one's goal, one's political goals, via practical means, rather than having idealism drive political decisions. In other words, you may not get whatever you want right away, but making steps toward that is far more important than just being idealistic. In other words, practical versus idealism. This new political era emerged where nationalist goals were achieved step by step in a very Machiavellian fashion. And we see the examples of this, including German unification, Italian unification, Hungarian autonomy. In France, Emperor Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, would have to cater to liberals in order to maintain effective control. So if you are a liberal, this begins to work. And we see this. It plays out. Let's start with the Crimean War. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. This occurs due to the failure of the concert of Europe. Its credibility had been undermined by the failure of the great powers to cooperate during those revolutions of 1848. And now between 1848 and 1878, peace between Europe was interrupted by this Crimean War and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878. Now, what caused the Crimean War? Well, ostensibly land. There was a major dispute between the two groups of Christians over privileges in the Holy Land, Palestine. In 1852, the Turks, who controlled Palestine, agreed to Napoleon III's demands to provide enclaves in the Holy Land for the protection of Roman Catholic religious orders. This agreement seemed to jeopardize existing agreements, which provided access to Greek Orthodox religious orders that Russia favored. Under Tsar Nicholas I, he ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled provinces along the Danube River. Russia would withdraw once the Turks had guaranteed rights for Orthodox Christians. So this is our old issue of Orthodox versus Roman Catholic Christians. Turks declared war on Russia in 1853 when Nicholas refused to withdraw from the Danubian provinces. In 1854, both France and Britain declared war on Russia. To some, this was a major surprise, as the Turks were not really even Christian, but yet they had been supported by both Britain and France, who were Christian countries. There were 4 points included in the following provisions. Russia had to renounce claims to the occupied principalities on the Danube. Navigation of the mouth of the Danube River along the Black Sea would be internationalized. And finally, Russia had to renounce its special role of Greek Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. And any decision of the 4-point solution would have to be in concert with those 3 issues: renouncing claims, navigation of the mouth of the Danube River, and renounce their special role for Orthodox Christians. In 1855, Piedmont would join the war against Russia. Austria would agree to the 4 points and gave Russia the ultimatum to comply, or Austria would join the war. In other words, we are facing a world war. The new Tsar, Alexander II, agreed to accept the 4 points and end the war. Unlike Tsar Nicholas, who died in 1855, Alexander was opposed to continuing the war. Now, most of the war had been fought on the Crimean Peninsula along the Black Sea. Over 50,000 troops, both British and French, fought in the Crimea against Russian forces, seeking to take the Black Sea port city of Sebastopol. Now, this is where we also start to see this very famous person in history, Florence Nightingale. She was a British nurse who became a pioneer in modern nursing. During the Crimean War, more men died of disease than from combat wounds. Nightingale's Light Brigade was superbly tending to the wounded men during the war, although fatalities due to disease remained high. But she will make her name caring for these men and revolutionize both the nursing profession and women's role in nursing. This will finally be resolved, however, with the Peace of Paris. Russia will emerge as the biggest loser in the conflict. Russia will no longer have control of maritime trade along the Danube, had to recognize Turkish control of the mouth of the Danube, and renounced claims to Moldavia and Wallachia, which became Romania. Russia renounced its role as protector of the Greek Orthodox residents within the Ottoman Empire. Russia agreed to return the all-occupied territories within the Ottoman Empire. The Black Sea remained neutral. And finally, independence and integrity of the Ottoman Empire was recognized and guaranteed. In other words, what was the real legacy here? Russia was shocked. They had fallen so far behind in military power. And Russia began its move toward industrialization and modernization of its army, so that it will be ready during World War I and later World War II. Now, back in France, we are going to experience the Second Republic, or the Second French Republic. This will last from 1848 to 1852. They created a National Assembly, a unicameral legislature, a strong executive power under President Louis Napoleon, and would popularly elect the President of the Republic under universal male suffrage. He was dedicated to law and order. He opposed socialism and radicalism. He favored the conservative classes, the church, the army, property owners, and businesses. He had lived much of his life outside France and thus had very little political baggage. Voters were swayed by the Napoleonic legend of greatness and stability and the desire to have another Bonaparte on the throne. Now, in return for the support of the conservatives, Louis Napoleon had to make concessions, including the Follow laws. Louis Napoleon returned control of education to the church, and in return the church supported him. It minimized the influence of the legislative assembly. He supported policies favorable to the army, disenfranchised many poor people from voting, and destroyed the democratic socialist movement by jailing and exiling its leaders and closing down labor unions. The Legislative Assembly did not grant Louis Napoleon either payment of his large personal debt or allowance for a second term. In response, Louis Napoleon plotted a coup and became Emperor Napoleon, or the Second Empire, or the Liberal Empire. So Emperor Napoleon III took control of the government in a coup d'etat in December of 1851 and became emperor the following year. He restored universal suffrage, and 92% of the people voted to make him president for 10 years. France was the only country in Europe at the time to provide universal suffrage. In 1853, 97% of the voters would make him a hereditary emperor. Over the course of the 1850s, his control was direct and authoritarian. He strengthened central power, he censored the press, and sponsored official candidates for election. Official. In other words, people he picked. During his tenure from 1859 to 1870, Napoleon III set out to build a quote-unquote liberal empire by initiating a series of reforms. He will provide a model for other political leaders of Europe, demonstrating how a government could reconcile popular and conservative forces through authoritarian nationalism. These economic reforms would provide for a healthy economy, including infrastructure, including railroads, canals, roads. In fact, Baron Georges von Haussmann would redevelop Paris. We talked about him earlier. He created a movement toward free trade. In fact, French exports doubled between 1853 and 1864. He signed a liberal treaty with Britain in 1860. And perhaps the first time any modern state played such a direct role in stimulating the economy. French investors financed large infrastructure projects in Russia, Spain, and Italy, including the Suez Canal in Egypt. He will extend the power of the Legislative Assembly. Members would be elected by universal suffrage every 6 years. Oppositional candidates had greater freedoms. And he would return control of secondary education to the state, stripping it from the Catholic Church. In response to this, Pope Pius IX would issue the Syllabus of Errors that condemned liberalism. He also permitted trade unions and their right to strike. Now, French foreign policy struggles would result in strong criticism of Napoleon III in demonstrating his ultimate weakness as a ruler. He sent French troops to Italy to rescue and restore Pope Pius IX. This was an act condemned by Republicans, those supported by the conservatives and moderates. The French involvement in the Crimean War will anger Republicans and liberals alike, who saw that another war, possibly another continent-wide war, was brewing. There was the issue of colonialism in Algeria and other colonies in Africa and Indochina and Mexico, including that he took over Mexico in what is known as the Mexican intervention. And then finally, during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, and the capture of Napoleon III would result in the collapse of the Second French Empire. And here again, we will see this play out also in Italy. After the collapse of the revolutions of 1848 and 1849, a unification movement in Italy shifted to Sardinia Piedmont under King Victor Emmanuel. Count Cavour and Garibaldi. And you can see them on the screen there. They will replace the earlier revolutionary leaders. And Realpolitik, rather than romanticism, was the justification for unification. Machiavellian approach, practical politics. So here's how it plays out. Under Count Camillo of Sardinia Piedmont will lead the struggle for Italian unification. Count Camillo is going to serve as King Victor Emmanuel's prime minister from 1852 to 1861. And essentially, he's a moderate nationalist and aristocratic liberal. He will replace the earlier failed unification of the Young Italy movement. There is no romantic illusions of a unified Italy, such as those of the earlier generation, but rather will carry this out through Realpolitik. For instance, the editor of the local newspaper began to argue that Sardinia should be the foundation of a new unified Italy. And the men will guide Sardinia Piedmont into a liberal and economically viable state. It will be modeled upon the French Constitution of 1830, including some social civil liberties, parliamentary government with elections, and parliamentary control of taxes. It will reform the judicial system, build up infrastructure including roads and canals and ports, seek to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church. And of course, in response to this, Pope Pius IX issued that syllabus of errors, warning Catholics against liberalism. Now, ultimately, Sardinia Piedmont would gain Lombardy, but not Venetia, as a result of his war with Austria. In 1860, Cavour will arrange the annexation of Parma, Modena, Romagna, and Tuscany into Sardinia. French supported this in return for receiving the territories of Nice and Savoy. And then here comes Giuseppe Garibaldi. He will be the one who liberates southern Italy and Sicily. He exemplifies the romantic nationalism of Mazzini and the earlier Young Italy revolutionaries. By 1860, he and 1,000 red shirts will land in Sicily and extend the Nationalist Party to the south. By September, Garibaldi took control of Naples and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Now, although Cavour distrusted Garibaldi, Victor Emmanuel II encouraged Garibaldi's exploits in the south of Italy. Garibaldi thus allowed his conquest to be absorbed into Sardinia Piedmont. In February 1861, Victor Emmanuel was declared King of Italy, presiding over an Italian parliament which represented all of Italy except for Rome and Venice. In 1866, Venice was incorporated into the Italian kingdom as a result of an alliance with the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. In 1871, Rome was captured by Italian troops and became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. Again, this was not a wholesale revolution, but yet this was rather a step-by-step process that takes 30 years to get done. But the result is a unified Italy. And there will be a very similar path in Germany. I'm going to move myself to the top of the screen real quick. And Germany's finally here. After 1815, Prussia emerged as an alternative to the Habsburg-based Germany. Their plan, the Klein Deutsch plan, was a plan for a unified Germany without Austria. It was seen as the most practical means of unification among the various German states, particularly Prussia. The drive for this was led by Otto von Bismarck, he was based in Prussia. He was obsessed with power and employed the quote-unquote gap theory to gain favor with the king. There was an army bill crisis that created a stalemate between the king and legislature over reforms of the army. Bismarck insisted that Prussian constitution contained a gap that did not mention what to be done if the stalemate developed. Since the king had granted the constitution, Bismarck insisted that he would ignore the liberals, the middle class, in the legislature and just follow his own judgment, saying, and I quote, "The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and resolutions." That was the blunder of the 1848 and 1849, but rather by blood and iron, unquote. In other words, they reached a stalemate over reforms of the army, and rather than try to continue to negotiate, they simply just clamped down and declared essentially a dictatorship. In other words, used brute force and systematically, step by step, take over the individual kingdoms. Which leads us to the Austro-Prussian War, the 7 Weeks' War, aka the German Civil War of 1866. Bismarck sought a localized war against Austria. He made diplomatic preparations for war with Austria by negotiating with France, Italy, and Russia for non-interference. Prussia's use of railroads to mass up troops and use the breech-loading rifle that proved far superior to Austria's military efforts. Prussia's victory unified much of Germany without Austria. The Klein Deutsch Plan prevailed. Austria was given generous peace terms. Italy received Venice from Austria. And then in 1867, the North German Confederation established Bismarck, the king. In 1867, the North German Confederation established by Bismarck provided and made King William I as president. It included all the German states except Baden, Württemberg, Bavaria, and Saxony. So the vast majority of Germany. The federal constitution allowed each state to retain its local government. The parliament, known as the Reichstag, consisted of 2 houses that shared power equally: the upper house, that included representatives from each state, and the lower house, that had elected by universal male suffrage. This new government structure gave Bismarck the ability to circumvent the middle class by appealing directly to the working classes, much like Napoleon III had done in France. Thus, the German middle class did not gain much influence until World War I. Next, Bismarck sought to provoke a war with France to further unify Germany and annex the Alsace-Lorraine. Bismarck boasted that a French diplomat had been kicked out of Germany after asking William I to not interfere with the succession of the Spanish throne. The alleged snub was exaggerated by Bismarck, intentionally to provoke a war with France. This infuriated France, and they would declare war against Germany. Bismarck used that war with France to bring the 4 remaining German states into the North German Confederation: Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and Saxony. The apparent ease with which Prussia defeated France sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Paris fell to the Germans. In January 1871, Napoleon III was captured, leading to the Treaty of Frankfurt, where the Alsace and Lorraine were ceded to Germany. On January 18, 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed. Germany was now the most powerful nation in Europe. William I became Emperor of Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm. Bismarck became the Imperial Chancellor. And the German Empire's government was essentially the same federal structure as it had been in 1866, but in reality, the Reichstag power was reduced. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, bring this up back down here, still had addressed the national aspirations of its various ethnic groups. The Hungarians and the Czechs continued to demand self-determination, or at very least, a semi-autonomous state. Austria's defeat by Germany in 1866 weakened its grip on power, forced it to make compromises, and established the so-called dual monarchy, known as the Ausgleich, or Compromise, of 1867. It officially created the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hungarians now had their own assembly, cabinet, and administrative system, which would support and participate with Austria in the imperial army and the imperial government. The results? Austria assimilated the Hungarians and nullified them as a primary opposition group. It also led to a more efficient government. Now, the hard part, however, was managing the government. The government was not integrated due to differences among the ethnic groups. The language used in government and school was a particularly divisive issue. In Bohemia, the issue of whether schools should use Czech or the German language became a very sticky issue. Efforts by both conservatives and socialists to diffuse national antagonisms by stressing economic issues proved unsuccessful. Universal male suffrage was not adopted until 1907, and anti-Semitism, or anti-Jewish, was very profound in Austria. Jewish populations were regularly targeted within Austrian cities, and the Jewish populations were growing rapidly ever since 1867, when they obtained full equality under the Austrian law. Many Jewish businesses were successful, especially in banking and trade, while Jewish artists, intellectuals, and scientists emerged, people like Sigmund Freud. German extremists charged Jews with controlling the economy and corrupting German culture with alien ideas in ultra-modern art. I'm sure all this ethnic diversity, of course, will not have any issue in the future. Serbian assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, I do want to return, however, to the issue of the Jewish bankers. Now, there is a really long history of the stereotype of Jewish bankers who are manipulating or controlling the economy. This is a very long since beat a dead horse idea. Now, the reason that the Jews became heavily invested in banking was not because it was their desire, but rather it was by design. Understand that, especially beginning with the medieval period, most Christians believed that it was not their job, and it might even be sinful for a Christian to run a bank, because a bank by nature needs to make money, and they do so by charging interest, or what's called usury. There are scriptures in the New Testament that say that Christians should not charge usury, but rather if they have a loan, fine, but they must pay back the loan in full, but no more, no less. And so many Christians interpreted that as Christians can't own banks because Christians can't charge interest, and a bank must charge interest to survive. Enter Jews. There were a lot of Jewish populations living among these Christians in Europe. And because Christians could not own banks, many times Christians sought the Jewish populations to run the banks, to provide loans and investments, because they were the ones who were allowed to charge interest and usury. And so they were put there by design as one of the few jobs they were allowed to do by Christian populations, and then later were being charged by Christian populations as being, well, devilish or manipulating the economy. And so it was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy issue. Now, that's Realpolitik. We've seen now the unification of Germany and Italy, which of course is going to set the stage for World War I, which I promise is coming soon. But until next time, take care, and bye-bye.